The alarm did not wake me. I was already awake, standing in the dark corridor of Bunker 7 with a cold cup of coffee in my hand and a live feed from the orbital array on my wrist screen. 3 ships, 6, then 14, all of them dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a neat half-circle above the equator. Their hulls glowing from re-entry heat, each one the size of a city block. They were not trying to hide. That was the part that got under my skin. They wanted us to see them coming. My name is Leon Harker. I was 31 years old, and I had already survived 2 continental resource conflicts, 1 engineered plague that took 40% of my home city, and a winter so long and violent that people stopped naming the months. I was not special. Every person in that bunker had a story just like mine, or worse. That is what nobody outside our atmosphere ever understood. We were not the lucky ones who made it. We were just the ones who kept showing up. The Accord's first transmission came in at 0312 hours. It was broadcast in 31 languages, every major dialect on Earth covered, every tonal variation accounted for. Whoever had been watching us had been watching for a long time. The message was calm, polished, and deeply condescending in the way that only something very old and very comfortable can manage. People of Earth, the Galactic Accord extends formal recognition to your species. You have been monitored and assessed. Your civilization has reached a threshold that permits limited integration into the broader community of sentient life. We come in peace. We ask only that you receive our delegates with openness and without hostility. Lieutenant Kara Moss, standing 2 feet to my left, read the transcript over my shoulder and said nothing for 4 seconds. Then she said, without hostility, they really said that. They did. To us. To us. She handed me a second coffee from somewhere behind her without looking away from the screen. I took it. We stood in silence for a moment and watched the ship's hold position, perfectly still, waiting for us to be impressed. The thing about growing up on Earth is that you develop a very specific relationship with things that present themselves as safe. You learn early that safety is not a gift. It is something you check, double-check, test under pressure, and never fully trust. Every generation before mine had learned that lesson. It was written into our bones the way cold is written into stone. When you are handed something beautiful and painless, you look for the catch. Not because you are paranoid, because you have read enough history to know what happens to the people who do not. The Velhari, that is what they called themselves, the lead species of the Accord, the ones whose flag was first on every document, had a lovely homeworld. I saw images of it later. Rolling blue plains, 3 gentle moons, a sun that never got too close and never went too dark. A planet so stable that their geological record barely showed a tremor in 800,000 years. No ice ages, no meteor impacts in recorded history. No diseases that crossed species barriers. They had lived in a garden so long that they had forgotten gardens had walls. Earth did not have walls. Earth had everything trying to get through. I remember the first time I explained our history to a Velhari academic named Oren, soft-spoken, 3 feet taller than me, with 4 arms and eyes the color of shallow water. He was doing what he called a cultural intake survey, which was their polite phrase for trying to understand why we behaved so strangely. I told him about the last ice age. He asked how long it lasted. I told him. He was quiet for a moment and then asked how many people survived it. I told him that too. He looked at me the way you look at something you cannot quite fit into any category you already have. And after that, he asked. We rebuilt, I said. And then there was a plague, and then a volcanic winter. And then a world conflict that lasted 6 years and killed millions, and then another plague. And then 2 more conflicts. And then we nearly cooked the whole atmosphere. And then we fixed most of that. And then there was the fracture period, which you probably have no word for. And then the resource conflicts of the last century. And then 3 more engineered outbreaks. And now here we are talking to you. He looked at his notes. He looked at me. And your species considers itself to be in a stable period right now? Relatively, I said. He did not ask any more questions that day. The first delegation landed 3 weeks after the initial transmission. They chose a flat valley in what used to be northern Canada, wide open sky, no tall structures nearby, a place where anyone approaching could be seen from a great distance. They thought that would make us feel safe. They did not understand that humans do not need to see everything coming to feel safe. We do not feel safe. We feel ready. The delegate who stepped out first was tall, green-skinned, and wearing clothing so clean it looked like it had never been outside before. His name, when translated into something my tongue could manage, came out roughly as Sevan. He was flanked by 6 others, all of them dressed in formal colors, none of them carrying anything that looked like a weapon. They had clearly done their research. They knew visible weapons would be read as a threat. What they had not done was research the person waiting to meet them. Nora Kane was 17 years old. She had volunteered for the welcome detail because she was the junior communications officer on duty. And nobody more senior had wanted the assignment. She was small, dark-haired, and had been wearing the same worn jacket for 3 years because it had belonged to her older brother before the second resource conflict took him. She stood at the edge of the landing zone with a translation device in one hand and a full incident report in the other. And when Savan stepped toward her with a formal greeting gesture and a warm diplomatic smile, she looked at him with the same expression she gave everything she encountered for the first time, clear-eyed, measuring, and entirely without fear. He stopped walking. I watched from the monitoring station. His biometric feed, which our systems had been reading since he stepped outside, spiked in a way our analysts had to look up. It was the Vilhari equivalent of a cold shock. Something in the way she looked at him, something in the complete absence of awe or relief or any of the reactions they had clearly expected, had triggered something ancient and involuntary in his nervous system. It was the first honest moment of contact between our species. Later that evening, after the formal introductions were done and the delegation had retreated to their temporary habitat, I pulled Seven aside in the translation corridor. He was still composed, still polished, but there was something different in the way he held himself. Like a person who had walked into a room and realized it was larger than the building looked from the outside. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course," he said. "When you looked at Nora, what did you feel?" He was quiet for a moment. He chose his words the way someone chooses footing on uncertain ground. "We were briefed extensively on your species. Biological data, social patterns, conflict history, technological development. We were told to expect defensiveness, distrust, possibly aggression." He paused. "We were not told to expect indifference." "She was not indifferent," I said. "She was assessing." "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what unsettled me." I walked back to the bunker in the dark. The orbital array was still up, still tracking the 14 ships above. They had not moved. They were waiting for us to decide how we felt about all this. They had arrived expecting to be the most significant thing we had ever encountered. And for most species, that would have been true. A visit from beyond the stars, proof that we were not alone, a hand extended from the impossible dark that would have broken open the sky for most civilizations. For us, it was the 14th most dangerous thing that had happened that month. I sat down in my chair, looked at the stars on the screen, and thought about every person who had come before me and made the choice to still be here. Every generation that had faced something unsurvivable and survived it anyway. Every child raised on a planet that seemed to want them gone, who grew up, looked up, and kept going. We had not been given peace. We had not been given safety. We had been given a world that tested everything it touched, and we had passed every single test. The galaxy had no idea what it had just knocked on the door of. I finished my coffee. I opened the next briefing report. Outside, the stars were the same as they always were. Indifferent, vast, and full of things that did not yet know what we were. They were about to find out. I walked into the Grand Conclave 3 months after the landing in Canada, and the first thing I noticed was the air. It was perfectly temperature-controlled, perfectly circulated, filtered to a standard so clean it felt slightly unreal, the way fresh air only feels to someone who grew up breathing air that was not always clean. The conclave chamber was built into a space station the size of a small moon, positioned at a gravitational midpoint between 4 inhabited systems. Every species in the Accord had contributed to its construction. The architecture showed it. 5 different structural philosophies competing politely with one another, across a building that should not have been able to stand, and somehow did. There were 42 species represented. I was the first human to sit in that room as a full delegate. My name is Leon Harker, and I was carrying a briefcase, a translation earpiece, and absolutely nothing else. The treaty terms required that all delegates enter unarmed. I had agreed to those terms. I had read them 3 times before signing, the way my mother taught me to read anything with conditions attached. What the terms did not account for was that a human being, any human being, already carries more adaptive threat capacity than most species consider possible without a weapon. We are not fragile. We were never fragile. We just learned to look like we might be when it was useful. The chamber had 412 seats arranged in a broad oval, with a central speaking floor ringed by a soft blue light. Delegates from the Vilhari sovereignty sat in the largest block, 30 seats, their formal robes in deep green and silver, their posture carrying the natural ease of a species that had run the Accord for 300 years. To their left were the Tharkan, tall and gray-skinned, methodical in everything including the way they arranged their paperwork. The Oreshi, barely 4 feet tall and covered in fine copper-colored fur, sat in a cluster near the back and communicated among themselves in frequencies my earpiece caught only as a soft hum. The Miran, the oldest species in the Accord, sat alone at the far end of the oval, saying nothing as they apparently had said nothing in the chamber for the last 60 years. Nobody was entirely sure if they were still paying attention or simply very good at appearing to. I sat in the chair marked for the human delegation and opened my briefcase, one folder, one pen, a small photograph of my city from before the last conflict, which I kept not for sentimentality but to remind myself what the word before means and what kind of work goes into making sure there is always an after. Senator Ruel of the Velhari opened the session. He was older than the delegate Savan, his skin a deeper shade of green, his 4 hands folded with the practiced stillness of a person who had been the most important figure in every room he had entered for decades. He welcomed me warmly. He spoke about the historic significance of humanity's introduction to the Accord. He used the phrase "a young species finding its footing among older, wiser neighbors" twice in 2 different ways, as if once had not been clear enough. I let it land. I did not react. I wrote one word in my folder, footing. Delegate Pren of the Tharkan, who was sitting 3 seats to my left, leaned over very slightly and said in a low voice, "You are not what they expected." "What did they expect?" I said quietly, without looking up from my folder. "Something more overwhelmed," he said. "I'll work on it," I said. He made a sound that my earpiece translated as the Tharkan equivalent of a suppressed laugh, which I later learned was considered moderately inappropriate in formal session. I decided immediately that Pren was someone worth knowing. The morning session covered administrative matters, border protocols, communication channels, the formal registration of Earth as a provisional member world. I listened to everything. I signed what I was asked to sign and flagged 3 clauses for review by our legal team before finalizing. The Velhari representative handling the documents looked briefly surprised that I had flagged anything. I did not explain. The clauses in question were not immediately dangerous, but they contained language flexible enough to be used against us later. And I had grown up in a world where later always came. The afternoon session was when things got interesting. It began with a presentation on Accord military structure, delivered by a Velhari general named Sova. He was precise, confident, and very thorough. He showed fleet compositions, engagement protocols, the distribution of patrol zones across Accord space. He spoke about humanity's existing fleet with an almost paternal tone. "Your current vessels show admirable ingenuity given your resource limitations," he said. And the phrase "your resource limitations" settled into the room with the weight of a verdict. He pulled up an image of one of our heavy-class ships, the kind we had been building for the last 40 years in the orbital yards above Earth. The image was accurate. Our ships were not sleek. They were dense and layered and built for function over form, with reinforced hulls thick enough to take significant impact and internal compartments designed to stay operational even after major structural damage. They were, by the Accord's visual standards, ugly. "Rail propulsion systems," Sova said, with a tone you might use to describe a child's drawing. "Crude fusion cores, no shielding technology above standard grade." He was correct on all 3 points. He was also missing about 60% of the picture, and I made a note of exactly which 60% he had not mentioned, and exactly why, and filed it somewhere useful in the back of my mind. After the session, 3 junior Velhari delegates stood near the corridor entrance and spoke quietly among themselves in their own language, apparently forgetting or not caring that my earpiece covered 17 of their dialects. They were discussing our fleet. They found it amusing. One of them used a phrase that translated roughly as "cargo haulers with ambition." I kept walking. I did not let my pace change. I had long since learned that the most useful information people give you is the information they don't realize they're giving. That evening I was invited to a small dinner with 4 other delegates: Pren from the Tharkan, a quiet Oreshi named Fefen, a Myran observer whose name I could not pronounce, and who communicated only through a translation device that seemed to predate several of the other technologies in the room, and a Velhari cultural attaché named Lessa, who had been assigned, I suspected, to evaluate me socially. She was professional and warm, and asked very good questions in a very natural way. She asked about Earth's history. I told her the short version. She asked about our medical systems. I told her about the plague responses, the outbreak management, the field medicine protocols developed during the conflicts. She asked about our food. I told her that depended heavily on which decade she was asking about. She laughed. She was genuinely funny herself, quick and dry, and I found myself actually enjoying the conversation, which was not something I had planned for. Near the end of the meal she asked, more carefully than the question sounded, whether humans felt afraid of anything. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said. Plenty of things. Like what? She asked. Failing the people depending on us, I said. Running out of time, repeating old mistakes, losing someone we could have protected. I paused. The usual things. She was quiet for a moment. Those are not the fears I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. The dark. Large predators. Being alone. We dealt with all of those, I said, a long time ago. They stopped being worth worrying about. She looked at me with an expression I had started to recognize on alien faces. Not hostility, not mockery, but the particular stillness of a person recalibrating something they thought they already understood. On the fourth day I was taken, along with a small group of other new delegates, on what the Accord called an orientation tour of the station's medical wing. It was led by a Velhari physician named Dr. Kale, who was clearly excellent at his work and equally clearly had never treated a human patient, and had done his reading but not quite enough of it. He was explaining the station's general trauma response capabilities when he turned to me and asked, in a genuinely curious rather than condescending way, whether human healing rates were as unusual as the reports suggested. I told him I didn't know what the reports said, so he should tell me what he had read and I would tell him whether it was accurate. He consulted his notes. He said that according to Accord biological assessments, humans healed soft tissue damage at roughly 3 to 5 times the rate of comparable species, that we maintained physical function under pain levels that would render most species non-operational, that we had been documented continuing complex coordinated activity, tactical, mechanical, communicative, after injuries that in any other known species would have caused immediate incapacitation. He looked up from his notes. Is that accurate? More or less, I said. How? He asked. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer. Practice, I said. He stared at me for a moment. That cannot be the complete explanation. We had a long time to get used to being damaged, I said. The body learns, it adapts, and the mind learns not to stop when the body hurts because stopping was worse. He made a note, several notes. The kind of notes a person makes when something they thought was a minor data point turns out to be the whole story. 2 days later, I was called to a private meeting with Pren, who had requested the session through official channels but showed up alone, without staff, which was unusual for a Tharkan of his rank. He sat down, folded his long gray fingers together, and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. I am going to share something with you, he said, that I am not officially permitted to share. All right, I said. He slid a data chip across the table. This is a classification summary from the Accord's Internal Security Division. It was prepared 8 years ago, when your orbital emissions first crossed the detection threshold, and they knew your species would reach us eventually. I picked it up. I looked at him. Read it in private, he said. I am sharing it because I think you should know what this institution actually thinks of your people rather than what it says in open session. He stood. I also want you to know that I voted against the classification myself, for what that is worth. He left. I sat alone in the room for a moment, looking at the chip in my hand. That night, in my quarters, I read it. It was thorough, detailed, compiled from decades of remote observation, atmospheric samplings, signal intercept, structural analysis of our orbital technology. It cataloged our conflicts, our casualties, our recoveries. It noted our healing rates, our endurance records, our documented behavioral patterns under extreme stress. It observed that humans did not demonstrate the standard de-escalation responses common to most sentient species when cornered or overwhelmed. It noted that rather than displaying submission behaviors when outnumbered, humans had a documented tendency to become more coordinated and more efficient. The final line of the summary read, Recommendation: maintain observation tier status indefinitely. Do not provoke. Do not corner. Do not, under any circumstances, allow this species to reach a position where they believe they have nothing left to lose. I set the chip down. I looked at the ceiling of my quarters, which was the same perfect temperature as the rest of the station. And I thought about every human being who had ever been cornered and come out the other side of it. They had been watching us for years. They had seen the numbers, the data, the history, and the conclusion they had reached was not that we were dangerous because we were violent. It was that we were dangerous because we were undeterrable. There is a difference. Violence can be matched, contained, responded to in kind. You cannot match something that simply does not stop. You cannot contain a species whose entire identity was forged in the process of surviving things that were supposed to end them. I slept well that night, better than I had since arriving, because I finally understood where I was, not in a welcome hall, not at an introduction ceremony. I was in a room full of people who had been afraid of us before we ever said a word, and now that I was sitting at their table, they were watching to see whether their fear was justified. I intended to give them an honest answer to that question. The next morning I walked back into the conclave chamber, sat in my chair, opened my folder, and waited for the session to begin. Pren gave me a small nod from across the oval. Lessa gave me a professional smile. Senator Rule took the floor and began another address about cooperation and mutual prosperity and the great family of civilized species moving forward together. I wrote one word in my folder. Then I closed it. The word was ready. The call came through at 0317 in the station's standard time cycle. I was not asleep. I rarely slept through the early hours. A habit from the conflict years that never fully left, my body running its own private security protocol long after the original threat had passed. I was sitting at the small desk in my quarters, going through the Accord's proposed shipping lane adjustment, which was boring enough to be its own kind of restful, when the priority signal overrode everything on my screen. The text was short. The timestamp was 3 hours old by the time it reached me, delayed by a relay issue in the outer network. 12 words. Unks Meridian, contact lost. Last known position, Cathara boundary. All hands. I read it twice. I set the tablet down on the desk with the careful steadiness of someone who has learned that the first few seconds after bad news are critical, and that how you spend them matters. The Meridian was a colony vessel, not a military ship, not a patrol craft, a colony vessel. 14,000 people in transit to a settlement site in the outer expansion zone. Families, engineers, agricultural specialists, medical staff, children. It had been in service for 4 years without incident. Its last routine check-in had been clean, and now it was gone, somewhere near the boundary of Cathara sovereignty space. And nobody was saying the word that was already sitting in the center of the room. By 0400 I was in the Emergency Communications Center, standing next to Commander Faye Doran, who had been the human delegation's senior military attaché for 2 years, and who now had the particular expression of someone who has mentally run through every possible explanation, and arrived at the one they were hoping not to find. The Cathara response came in an hour ago, she said, pulling the transcript onto the main screen. They're calling it a navigational incident. Say the vessel strayed into a restricted zone. Say there was a collision event with Cathara infrastructure. They express regret. I read the transcript. The language was formal, precise, and notably free of any offer to assist with recovery, any detail about the nature of the collision, any information about the Meridian's final position, and any acknowledgement of what expressing regret actually means when you are the party responsible for the regret. They have not offered to return the wreckage, I said. No, or the personal effects. No, or any survivors. Faye looked at me. Their statement does not mention survivors. There it was. I walked into the emergency conclave session 3 hours later. The chamber that had felt so still and formal during the opening ceremonies was a different room now. Delegates were in small groups, speaking quickly, with the particular contained energy of people who have been surprised by something they are trying to decide how to categorize. Senator Rule was at the center of a large cluster of Velhari advisors. He looked, for the first time since I had met him, like he was working hard at appearing composed. The session opened with a formal request from the Accord's Security Council for all parties to refrain from unilateral action while a joint inquiry was established. This was the standard protocol. This was how the Accord handled things, with procedure, with measured steps, with the careful management of conflict, through channels and committees and formal requests for documentation. Delegate Pren sat beside me. He said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then quietly he said, "They will recommend a 90-day inquiry window." "I know," I said. "Your government will not accept that." "No," I said. "What will they do?" I had received the second transmission 40 minutes before the session began. It was from Admiral K. Hollis, Earth Command, encrypted at the highest level, 4 sentences long. The first sentence told me what our response teams had already found at the last telemetry point. Meridian's emergency transponders, scattered across a debris field in Cathara boundary space, showing hull stress patterns inconsistent with any collision with fixed infrastructure. The stress patterns were consistent with directed energy impact from multiple angles. The second sentence told me that 3 of our fast response vessels were already in transit. The third sentence told me that they would arrive in Kithara space in approximately 60 hours. The fourth sentence told me to hold my position in the conclave, represent Earth's interests, and not commit us to any timeline that the response teams would be unable to honor. I held my position. I listened to the Accord debate the appropriate framework for establishing an inquiry committee. I listened to the Kithara representative, a stiff and precise individual named Delegate Vaughn, express continued regret and full cooperation with any official Accord process, while providing not a single piece of additional information. I watched Senator Rule carefully avoid looking directly at me for 90 minutes. At the 2-hour mark, I stood and requested the floor. Rule gave it to me after a brief hesitation. I want to be clear about what I am and am not saying, I began. I am not making an accusation in this chamber. I am not calling for punitive action from the Accord. I am not asking for anything from this body today. I paused and looked around the room. I am telling you, as a matter of courtesy and transparency, that the human delegation does not accept a 90-day inquiry window for an event involving 14,000 of our people. Earth will conduct its own investigation. We will share our findings with the Accord when they are complete. Rule said, with practiced calm, unilateral investigation activity outside Accord jurisdiction could be considered a destabilizing action. With respect, Senator, I said, 14,000 people is destabilizing. We are the response to that. I sat down. Pren did not look at me. He wrote something on his notepad and slid it toward me without looking up from his own work. It said, 60 hours is not very long. I wrote back, it is long enough. The fleet that left Earth's orbital yards 48 hours after the meridian went silent was not announced. There was no formal declaration, no press address, no flag waving at departure. 3 ships, designated as heavy transport and rapid response class, slipped out of orbit in a standard outbound vector and went quiet. That was it. No ceremony. In the Accord's experience, declarations of intent preceded action. You told your opponent what was coming so they could respond appropriately within the framework of established protocol. It was considered civilized. It was also, from a tactical standpoint, an extraordinarily generous gift to your opponent. We stopped giving gifts like that during the second resource conflict. I received the feed updates directly, streamed to my quarters through a secured channel. I watched the data come in over the next 2 days, without sleeping more than a few hours, running on coffee and the particular focused energy that takes over when everything is real, and there is no buffer left between you and the consequences. The commander of the response fleet was a woman named Captain Ada Sloan. I had met her once, briefly at a briefing in Geneva 2 years before her deployment. She was compact, quiet, and had the specific stillness of someone who does all their loudest thinking on the inside. She had served in 2 conflict theaters, survived a structural failure in deep space that had killed half her crew, and rebuilt her career from the bottom of the rank system afterward, with no complaints on record and a performance history that read like a manual on how to function under pressure. What the Kithara sovereignty had in their boundary zone was a standard patrol grid, 12 vessels in a rotating formation designed to cover the approach lanes into their inner systems. It was, by Accord military standards, a reasonable and well-organized defensive arrangement. Admiral Sova had probably graded it as above average in his last assessment. What it was not designed for was contact with ships that did not respond to warning signals the way ships were supposed to. The Accord's standard engagement protocol, the protocol every military force in the Accord trained to and planned around, operated on a series of expected responses. Warning signal issued, target slows and changes course. Warning signal ignored, target responds to second signal. Second signal ignored, target responds to weapons lock. The entire system was built on the assumption that the other party would, at some point, make the rational choice to stop. Because stopping was the behavior all Accord species displayed when they were outmatched or in danger. Ada Sloan ships received the first Kithara warning signal and reduced speed by exactly 3%. They received the second signal and maintained course. They received the weapons lock and maintained course. The Kithara patrol commander made a decision that, from his training and experience, was entirely reasonable. He fired. The first volley hit the forward shields of the lead ship and scattered. The shields on our vessels were not, as Sova had noted in his presentation, high-grade Accord technology. They were our own design, built heavier and denser than Accord standards specifically because our engineers did not trust anything they had not stress-tested past the point of failure at least twice. The volley hit and scattered and the ship kept moving. The Cathara commander fired again. The ship kept moving. There is a specific psychological term for what happens to a trained military strategist when a target that should stop does not stop. When everything your models predict says the engagement should be over, and the other party simply has not received that message. It had been documented in human military psychology literature for over a century, studied as a breakdown in tactical cognition that occurs when the opponent's behavior falls completely outside expected parameters. The Cathara patrol grid broke formation in the 4th minute of contact, not because they were beaten. They were 12 ships against 3. By numbers alone, they should have held. They broke because our 3 ships had taken 2 full volleys from 12 opponents and were still closing, still in formation, still communicating with each other, in clipped, calm transmissions that the Cathara signals teams were intercepting and could not understand, not the language. They had translation for that, but the tone, the absence of anything that sounded like alarm, like pain, like the desire to stop. 6 hours after first contact, the fleet held position 20,000 kilometers outside the Cathara home system. No further engagement, no advance. Ada Sloan opened a direct line to the Cathara command infrastructure and transmitted one message. It was not long. We want the full wreckage coordinates of the vessel Unx Meridian. We want the complete records of all command activity in the boundary zone for the 72 hours surrounding the contact event. We want the names of every officer involved in the authorization chain. We are not threatening invasion. We are not here to take anything from you. We are here to find our people and understand what happened to them. You have 6 hours. I was in my quarters on the station when the transmission reached me. I sat with it for a long time. Faye came in without knocking, which was the only way she ever entered a room. She read the transcript over my shoulder, straightened up and said, "Cathara Command is requesting a chord mediation." "Of course they are," I said. "Ruel wants to bring it to full session tomorrow." "Let him," I said. She sat down on the edge of the desk. "Leon, they found the Meridian's black box in the debris field. Preliminary signal analysis confirms the hull stress patterns. This was not an accident. I knew that. I had known that since the first night. But knowing something and hearing it stated in the particular flat tone of confirmed fact are 2 different experiences." "How many survivors?" I said. Faye was quiet for a second too long. "They're still scanning the debris field," she said. I nodded. I looked at the transmission on the screen. I looked at the stars outside the station viewport. The same stars I had grown up looking at from the other side. From the surface of a planet that had spent 1,000,000 years trying to break the things that lived on it. Those things had not broken. They had learned instead. They had built, and failed, and rebuilt, and kept going through every cold, dark thing the universe put in their way, and they had crossed the void between stars not to conquer, but to expand, to grow, to put their families somewhere new, and see what could be made there. Someone had taken that from 14,000 people. Someone had decided that our ships were cargo haulers with ambition, that our species was a minor entry in a classification report, that we were a young civilization finding its footing and could be managed accordingly. Ada Sloan's fleet was still holding position outside Cathara space, calm, in formation. Waiting, I opened my folder. I did not write a word. There was nothing to write yet. There was only the waiting, and the silence, and somewhere in the debris field between here and Cathara space, 14,000 reasons why the galaxy was about to learn something about us that no report, no assessment, no classification tier had ever fully captured. We did not stop. That was the whole story. That had always been the whole story. We did not stop. The Accord session the morning after Ada Sloan's fleet reached Cathara space was the most crowded I had seen the chamber since my arrival. Delegates who usually sent junior staff to morning sessions were sitting in their own chairs. The Myron observer, who in 11 weeks of sessions had remained so still and silent that I had once spent 20 minutes watching to confirm they were breathing, was leaning slightly forward. Slightly, for a Myron, apparently counted as riveted attention. Senator Ruel opened with a prepared statement calling for immediate de-escalation, the withdrawal of human vessels from the boundary zone, and the establishment of an emergency joint mediation panel to address the, as he put it, deeply unfortunate series of events surrounding the loss of a human colony vessel. He did not use the word lost. He used gone. He did not say destroyed. He said involved in a contact event. I wrote both of those phrases down and underlined them. Delegate Vaughn of the Cathara spoke next, continuing in the language of regret and cooperation while simultaneously providing a detailed technical argument for why the presence of our fleet in their boundary zone constituted an act of unprovoked aggression under 7 different Accord protocols. He was well prepared. His legal team had clearly worked through the night. He cited chapter references, protocol numbers, precedent cases. He spoke for 22 minutes without saying anything that addressed who had authorized the destruction of a civilian vessel, and why. When it was my turn, I stood and said 12 words. "We are not asking the Accord to act, we are acting." I sat down. The chamber had a sound after that, not quite silence, not quite noise. Something in between, like the air pressure changing in a room where all the windows close at once. Pren did not slide me a note this time. He looked at me directly and gave one small nod, the kind that means I understand exactly what you just did, and I am not going to comment on whether it was wise because it is already done. Back in my quarters that evening, I received the update from Ada Sloan's second transmission to Cathara Command. The Cathara had responded to the 6-hour deadline by requesting Accord mediation, then requesting an extension, then going quiet for 4 hours, sending a partial document set that included patrol logs with significant gaps, and a formal statement of condolence that still managed to avoid the direct phrase, "Sorry for what we did." Ada had responded by closing the distance by 10,000 kilometers. She had not fired, she had not threatened, she had simply moved closer. The third Cathara response came in 90 minutes later. It included complete patrol logs. It included the command authorization chain. It included the coordinates of the Meridian's debris field and a formal acknowledgement that the vessel had been engaged by Cathara patrol units operating under standing orders to enforce boundary restrictions by any means necessary against unregistered vessels. A 14,000-person colony vessel, registered with the Accord, flying a standard civilian transponder signal, had apparently not been considered registered enough. The debris field coordinates were transmitted to Earth Command and to the Accord simultaneously. Search and rescue teams from the nearest human outpost were already in transit before the transmission finished. They were not military teams. They were the same kind of people who had always shown up in the wreckage of things that should not have happened. Trained, quiet, carrying the equipment that matters when the emergency is over, and the work of finding and counting and bringing home begins. I did not sleep that night either. I sat at my desk, and I thought about the Accord's classification report, the one Pren had given me weeks before. I thought about the phrase that had stayed with me since the first time I read it. Do not allow this species to reach a position with us where they believe they have nothing left to lose. They had gotten that nearly right. But they had misidentified the mechanism. The most dangerous version of a human being is not a human being who has nothing left to lose. That version is real, and it is formidable, but it is also finite. It burns hot, and then it burns out. What the report had missed, what all their careful observations from a safe distance had missed, was the version that is worse. The version that has everything to protect, that has people it loves and a future it is building, and a memory of everyone it has already lost, and chooses, out of all of that, to remain controlled, to remain precise, to remain functional and clear-eyed and absolutely relentless in the specific direction of the problem. Ada Sloan was not out there because she had nothing to lose. She was out there because she had everything to protect, and she was good enough at her job to know the difference between those two states, and to operate from the second one. The full Accord inquiry that followed took 3 months. I attended every session. I submitted every document requested. I answered every question with complete accuracy and watched the chamber slowly process the shape of what had happened. Not just the incident itself, but the response to it, and what that response said about what humanity actually was. There was a session midway through the inquiry in which Rual raised, carefully and with diplomatic language, the question of proportionality. He noted that our response had been rapid and direct and had proceeded without Accord consultation. He framed this as a concern about the stability of the established order. I let him finish. Then I said, "Senator, proportionality is a concept for parties who share a baseline understanding of what normal looks like. We do not share that baseline with the Cathara sovereignty. They destroyed a civilian vessel. Our response was 3 ships and a conversation. I would encourage you to consider what proportionality means to a species that spent its entire history dealing with worse than this and surviving it." The chamber was quiet again with that specific pressure change quality. After the session, Lessa caught me in the corridor. She had been quiet throughout the inquiry, observing, making notes, doing her job as cultural attaché, with the same careful attention she always brought to it. She fell into step beside me without asking. "You are not making many friends in there," she said. "I did not come here to make friends," I said. I know, she said. I am saying it anyway because I think you might be someone worth saying it to. I looked at her. She had that expression again, the recalibrating one. But there was something else in it now, too. Something I thought might be, in its own careful way, respect. Lessa, I said, do you know what the first thing is that a human child learns? She shook her head. That the world does not adjust itself for them, I said. That if something is going to change, they have to change it. We learn that before we learn anything else. It goes so deep that most of us don't even notice it anymore. It just feels like breathing. She was quiet for a moment. That sounds exhausting. It is, I said. It is also the only reason we're here. The inquiry concluded with a formal censure of the Cathara sovereignty, the establishment of new civilian vessel protocols in boundary zones across Accord space, and a reparations framework that, while not adequate in any human moral sense, represented the largest punitive measure the Accord had imposed on a member state in 40 years. I signed the final documents. I shook hands, or the species-appropriate equivalent, with every delegate in the room. I sent the confirmation back to Earth Command, and then I went back to my quarters and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the stars for a long time. The debris field had yielded 312 survivors, out of 14,000. The search teams had kept going for 3 weeks after the standard cessation point, because that is what human search teams do. They do not stop at the standard cessation point. They stop when there is nothing left to find. 312 people were alive who would not have been if the teams had stopped at the protocol boundary. I thought about that number for a long time, about what it meant that it was so small, about what it meant that it existed at all. On my desk was a new folder. It had arrived from Earth Command the day before, marked for my review. It was not the Cathara matter. That was finished. This was something else. A new item for the next conclave session. The Accord had produced a proposal, Resolution 7. They were calling it, outlining new restrictions on human fleet development, colony expansion rights, and what they were terming high-yield energy systems. It had been submitted 2 weeks before the Cathara incident was fully resolved, which told me exactly when it had been drafted. Before our response. Before Ada Sloan moved her fleet. When they had still believed that the appropriate lesson from the Meridian was that humanity needed to be managed more carefully. I opened the folder. I started reading. I found the first loophole on page 3. There were, in the end, 11 of them. The folder from Resolution 7 sat on my desk for 6 days before the formal session. I read it 4 times, not because the language was difficult, but because I wanted to understand not just what it said, but what it was trying to do. Who had drafted each section, and what assumptions about us those drafters were operating from. Assumptions are the most useful thing to understand about an opponent, not their tactics, not their technology. Their assumptions, because assumptions are where the gaps live. Senator Rule presented Resolution 7 to the full chamber on a Thursday, which was standard. Thursdays were legislative days, the sessions longer and more formal, attendance at its fullest. He laid it out with his usual precision and warmth. Fleet development ceilings, expressed in tonnage and drive capacity. Colony expansion limits, framed as environmental protection for newly accessed systems. Restrictions on what they were carefully calling high-yield energy systems, which covered approximately 2/3 of our current weapons research program. Every clause was presented as a protective measure. For us, for the stability of newly integrated species, for the health of the broader Accord community. I sat and listened and counted the votes as they were announced. 40 species, all voting yes. 1 abstention from a small outer ring delegation whose representative gave me an apologetic look. Another abstention from Pren, who had apparently decided that neutrality was the most useful thing he could offer me at this moment. The resolution passed. Rule looked at me afterward, with an expression I had learned to read over the months of sessions, not hostility, not triumph, but the careful look of a person waiting to see which way a complicated thing would fall. I nodded to him. I collected my folder. I walked out. Faye was waiting in the corridor. She had read the resolution days ago. She had opinions about it that she had expressed, fully and in detail, in private, and had not mentioned again in professional settings, which was one of the things I valued most about her. 11 loopholes, she said. 11, I agreed. Which ones are you using first? I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, they are going to notice. Eventually, I said. By then it won't matter. What followed over the next 18 months was not defiance. I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters. Defiance is reactive. It is the behavior of something that has been stopped and is trying to move anyway. What we did was not defiance. It was engineering. Resolution 7 set a ceiling on fleet tonnage. It did not define what counted as fleet. Our transport and logistics vessels, which had been growing steadily for years in a development program the Accord had apparently never looked at closely, were reclassified under commercial infrastructure. They were not armed. They did not need to be. Their hulls were reinforced to a standard that made them, in practice, more durable than most Accord patrol ships. Their drives were upgraded under a separate research program, covered by an exemption in the resolution's environmental clause. The exemption had been written to allow for improved fuel efficiency on civilian ships. It turned out that improved fuel efficiency and improved drive performance were, from a certain engineering perspective, the same work. The colony expansion limits were tied to a specific definition of established settlement. New stations orbital, not surface, did not meet the definition. We built 22 of them in 14 months. The high-yield energy restrictions were written to cover directed energy systems. We invested heavily in projectile research. The Accord had not seen kinetic weapons as a significant technology in 300 years. They were not wrong that directed energy systems were more advanced. They were wrong that advanced was the only thing that mattered. I received a message from Lessa 4 months into this period. It was personal, not official. She said that several members of the Velhari Science Council had been reviewing our infrastructure submissions and had noted certain patterns that were, as she put it, generating discussion. I wrote back thanking her for letting me know. I told her the patterns would continue. She did not reply for 2 weeks. When she did, it was a single line. I thought so. Be careful. Pren visited me in person in the 7th month. He did not use official channels. He came in civilian clothes, which for a Tharkon of his rank was the equivalent of showing up in a disguise. He sat down and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has decided to simply say it. They are meeting in closed session, he said. The Security Council. Ruel, 3 Velhari admirals, 2 Cathara observers who have somehow retained their seats despite everything, and 4 representatives from species you have not dealt with directly yet. They are discussing options. What kind of options, I asked. The kind that use words like containment. I looked at him. Pren. They have been trying to contain us since before we got here. Resolution 7 is containment. The classification report was containment. The 90-day inquiry window was containment. This is different, he said. This is a discussion about whether to revoke provisional member status and reclassify Earth under the Protected Species Framework. I set down my pen. The Protected Species Framework was the Accord's mechanism for dealing with civilizations that had reached spacefaring capacity but were deemed, in the Accord's judgment, insufficiently stable for full integration. It came with a governance oversight panel, movement restrictions, resource allocation controls, and the suspension of autonomous military development. It had been applied to 4 species in Accord history. None of them were still using it, in the sense that none of them were still present enough in galactic politics to be using anything. They would not, I said. They are discussing it, Pren said. That is all I can confirm. But discussion at that level, in that room, becomes policy faster than you would expect. He left without staying for coffee. I sat alone and thought about this for a long time. Here is what I thought about. I thought about a fundamental misunderstanding that very smart, very old, very comfortable civilizations make when they look at something like us. They see the pressure we have been placed under, and they interpret the response as evidence of instability. The rapid adaptation, the non-standard problem-solving, the refusal to operate within expected parameters, to them, these look like warning signs, unpredictability, volatility, something that needs to be managed before it becomes dangerous. What they are actually seeing is competence. Every adaptation we made after Resolution 7 was not a symptom of instability. It was the product of a species that had been solving problems with limited resources in hostile conditions for longer than the Accord had existed. We did not find loopholes in their resolution because we were trying to undermine their authority. We found them because finding the path through an obstacle is simply what we do. It is not a choice. It is not a policy. It is what you become when the alternative to finding the path is lying down in the snow. I sent a message to Earth Command that evening. I told them what Pren had told me. I told them what I believed the Security Council's timeline looked like. I told them that I thought we were approaching a decision point, not just for our delegation, but for the entire relationship between humanity and the Accord, and that I needed to know where we stood. The response came back in 14 hours. Admiral Hollis herself, Text only, no encryption header because she did not need one. 3 words. We're ready, proceed. I read those words and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was closer to the feeling of a door opening into a room you have been standing outside for years. A week later, I filed a formal request for a special session of the full conclave. Not emergency, special. Emergency implied reaction. I was not reacting. I cited new developments in human accord relations requiring address by the full body. Standard procedure. Rule accepted the request with a note that said he looked forward to a productive dialogue. I spent the 6 days before the session at my desk, working, not on arguments, not on tactics, on documents. 1,200 pages of them, compiled from Earth's research archives, our medical databases, our engineering development records, our historical incident reports. Everything the Accord had never asked to see because they had assumed the summary was sufficient. The summary was not sufficient. The summary was what you show someone's and when you want them to form an opinion without understanding. I wanted them to understand. I received, 2 days before the session, a visit from a Velhari general I had not met before. He was older than Sova, older than Ruel, with the deeply lined face of someone who had been in difficult rooms for most of his life. He introduced himself as General Vor, said he was attending in an unofficial capacity, and sat down without being offered a chair. I did not point this out. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You know what they are planning." "Yes," I said. "And you are still going to walk into that chamber." He was quiet again. He looked at his hands. "I voted against the classification report," he said. 8 years ago. I was outvoted. I said then that poking something that has spent its entire existence being poked and not breaking was not a good strategy. I was told that management was the appropriate framework. He looked up. "I was wrong about one thing. I said you would be difficult to manage. What I did not say, because I did not fully understand it yet, was that you were impossible to contain." I looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," he said, standing, "I think whatever happens next, the record should show that someone in this institution understood." He moved toward the door. "Good luck, Mr. Harker. Though I suspect you do not need it." He left. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my quarters. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as always, the same ones I had grown up watching from Earth, just from a different angle now. I thought about everything that had been built and lost and rebuilt. Every generation that had handed the next one, not safety but endurance. Every child raised on a planet that tested everything it touched, taught by the simple fact of surviving it that they were capable of more than they had been told. The session was in 2 days. I went back to my documents. I was ready. I walked into the full conclave session on a clear-aired Tuesday morning with 1,200 pages of documentation, a translation earpiece, and the particular calmness that comes not from certainty of outcome, but from certainty of purpose. The chamber was full. Standing room full, which I had not seen before. Delegates who usually attended by proxy were present in person. Even the Myron observer had shifted position, very slightly, one arm resting on the desk in a way that suggested active engagement. Ruel opened with procedural formality, as he always did, but his voice carried something different today. A careful quality, like a person walking on ice they have assessed but not fully trusted. I requested the floor before the first administrative item was complete. Ruel granted it with a slight pause that told me he had expected me to wait, and had prepared for me waiting. I stood. "I am not here to argue," I said. "I am not here to present a grievance or to threaten this body or to make demands. I am here to do something that I believe this institution has not fully received from us yet, and that I think we owe each other." I set the documentation on the central table. Physical copies which almost nobody used anymore, because physical copies cannot be closed with a button. "This is a record," I said, "of what Earth is, not what your assessments concluded, not what your classification reports categorized. What we actually are, as documented by ourselves, across 4,000 years of recorded history." I did not read from it. I knew it well enough. "Your accord has existed for 300 years, I said. In that time you have had 4 significant interspecies conflicts, 2 periods of resource scarcity that affected fewer than 8% of your combined population, and 1 pandemic event that, with accord coordination, was contained within 18 months. I paused. In the last 300 years, Earth experienced 47 significant conflicts, 11 major pandemics, 3 near-extinction-level climate events that we addressed with partial technology and full determination, 2 periods of total economic collapse, and what our historians call the Long Dark, a 40-year window in which organized governance failed across most of the planet. and communities survived on nothing but local knowledge and the refusal to stop helping each other. The chamber was quiet. We did not come through all of that because we are heroes, I said. We did not come through it because we are stronger or smarter or more deserving than any species in this room. We came through it because we have a very specific relationship with the concept of stopping, and that relationship is that we do not. I looked around the room. At Ruel, composed and watching. At Pren, whose stillness had a different quality than usual. At Lessa, who was looking at her hands with the expression of someone hearing something confirmed that they had suspected for a long time. I know that this institution has been discussing reclassification of Earth under the Protected Species Framework, I said. Ruel's expression did not change, but 3 other delegates shifted in their seats. I am not going to argue against that proposal. I am going to explain, as clearly as I can, what it would mean. Steady. It would mean placing governance oversight on a civilization that survived 47 conflicts not by winning them, but by enduring past the point where winning was the metric. It would mean restricting the autonomous development of a species that responded to your Resolution 7 by finding 11 legal pathways through it before the ink was dry. It would mean attempting to contain something that your own classification report, written by your own analysts, described as impossible to allow into a position of having nothing to lose. I paused. And it would mean doing all of this while asking us to trust this institution with our safety. With our children on colony vessels, with our people in the boundary zones, the chamber held still. I am not threatening you, I said. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What I am doing is asking you to understand the difference between a species that is dangerous because it wants to take things from you, and a species that is dangerous because it will not let things be taken from it. The Accord has treated those 2 things as the same risk. They are not the same risk. They are not even in the same category. I picked up the first folder from the documentation stack. This section covers our medical research, 60 years of pathogen mapping, treatment development, and epidemic response protocols. We are offering it to the Accord's shared database. No conditions, no exchange requirement. Everything we have learned about how to keep people alive. I set it down. This section covers our deep space navigation data. 14 years of charting in the outer expansion zones, including hazard mapping that 3 Accord survey teams have attempted and not completed. We are offering it to the Joint Navigation Registry. I set that down too. This section is our full infrastructure development plan for the next 20 years, not the version we filed with the Development Committee. The real one. Everything we intend to build, why and what it will mean for traffic and resource distribution in our sector. I set the last folder down. We are not here to conquer you, I said. We are not here to replace you. We are not here to frighten you, although I understand that we do, and I understand why, and I am not dismissing that. I am asking you to ask yourself a different question. I looked at Ruel directly. Not how do we manage this, but what could this become if we stop trying to manage it and start trying to understand it? The silence lasted longer than any silence I had experienced in the chamber. Senator Ruel spoke, and his voice was different from every other time I had heard it. The practiced warmth was still there, but underneath it now was something less managed, something that sounded for the first time like genuine consideration. Mr. Harker, he said, what does humanity want from the Accord? I had thought about this question for a long time. I had drafted answers, revised them, thrown them out, started again. I had thought about what Pren would appreciate, what Lessa might understand, what Vor had said in my quarters 2 nights before. I had thought about every person back on Earth who had sent us here with nothing but the hope that maybe this time, things could be built instead of just survived. We want you to be worth protecting, I said. The silence this time was different. Not the pressure drop kind, not the carefully composed reaction of a body waiting to see which way a complicated thing would fall. Something quieter, something that moved through the room the way a real thing does when it arrives among people who were not quite expecting it to be real. Ruel held my eyes for a long moment. That, he said slowly, is not the answer I expected. I know, I said. It implies that you intend to protect us. It implies that we already have been, I said, in ways you have not noticed. In boundary zones where our patrols have turned back threats that never made it to your early warning systems. In the 3 plague vector sites in the outer ring that our medical teams flagged and contained before they became events. In the 40 years of quiet unannounced work that we did in the expansion zones, because the galaxy is not as safe as your 300 years of managed peace have allowed you to believe. I picked up the last folder from the stack. That is all documented here too. I set it on the table. I sat down. Pren was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on a Tharkan face before, something that was not quite emotion, because Tharkan faces did not carry emotion the way human faces did, but was the Tharkan equivalent of a person seeing something fit into place. Lessa was not looking at her hands anymore. The Myron observer had moved fully forward in their seat, both long arms on the desk, in what I later learned was the most visible display of engagement their species ever made in formal settings. It was apparently unprecedented in 60 years of their attendance at the conclave. The session lasted 4 more hours. I answered every question. I did not raise my voice. I did not retreat from a single point. When Delegate Vaughn of the Cathara, who had apparently retained enough standing to attend, attempted to reframe our response to the Meridian as aggression, I presented Ada Sloane's full transmission log, which showed that at no point had any human vessel fired a single shot, and that the resolution of the situation had been achieved entirely through the Cathara sovereignty's decision to respond to a conversation held at close range. Vaughn did not speak again after that. When the session ended, Ruel asked me to stay behind. He stood at the central table and looked at the documentation for a long time before speaking. He picked up the medical research folder. He looked at the cover. He set it back down. "This is genuine," he said. "The offer." "Yes," I said. "No conditions." He was quiet again. "I have been in this chamber for 30 years, Mr. Harker. I have presided over the integration of 11 species. I have managed crises, brokered agreements, guided very complicated situations toward outcomes that preserve the stability of this institution." He looked at me. "I have never, in 30 years, made the error of thinking that the institution was the point." I waited. "The point is the people," he said. "That is what you are saying. That is what you have been saying since you arrived. And I was hearing the surface of it, and not the whole of it." He took a long breath. "I will not bring the reclassification proposal to vote. I will need time to manage that decision politically. I will need some form of framework that allows the Security Council to feel the situation is being handled. But I will not bring it to vote." "I understand," I said. "In return," he said, "I need you to understand something." He looked at me steadily. "This institution is old, and it is careful, and it moves slowly, and those qualities frustrate you. I can see that clearly. But the reason it moves slowly is that fast decisions in this chamber have consequences across 42 species and hundreds of billions of lives. Every time I have to manage a crisis, it is because somewhere moved too fast." He paused. "I am asking you to be patient with us." I thought about every generation of people who had handed the next one not safety but endurance. I thought about a 17-year-old girl in a worn jacket who looked at the first alien diplomat she ever met and did not blink. I thought about Ada Sloane holding position outside Cathara, space, calm, in formation, waiting, not because she had been told to wait but because she understood the difference between being patient and being stopped. "We have been patient for a long time," I said. "We can be patient a little longer." He nodded. He gathered the documentation. "I will want to convene a smaller working group, informal, off the session record, to go through this properly." He held up the folder, all of it. "Whenever you are ready," I said. I left the chamber and walked down the long corridor toward the human quarter of the station. The lights in the corridor shifted from the Accord's standard blue-white to the slightly warmer tone that had been installed at our request 6 months ago. A small thing, almost nothing. Just a few degrees of color temperature. We had asked for it because the blue-white gave everyone headaches after long sessions, and the station engineers had accommodated the request without comment. A small thing. But the station had changed for us slightly. Just slightly. I stopped at the viewport at the end of the corridor and looked at the stars. They looked the same as they had over Earth. The same cold, vast, indifferent dark, full of everything we did not yet know. Full of threats that had not introduced themselves yet, and wonders we had not reached, and problems that would arrive one day without asking permission, the way all problems did. I thought about Nora Kane, who was not 17 anymore, who was now a general, stationed in the outer expansion zone, running patrols that the Accord did not yet fully understand the necessity of, who still wore a worn jacket when she was off duty, though it was a different one now, given to her by someone who had decided to pass something on rather than keep it. I thought about Ada Sloane, back at Earth's orbital yards, overseeing the construction of 3 new vessels that did not yet have names. She had already submitted the naming proposals to the registry. She had named them all after the Meridian's survivors. I thought about the 312 people who were alive because our search teams had kept going past the protocol boundary. and about the 13,688 who were not, and whose names were all recorded, and whose absence was not managed or processed or moved past but held the way humans hold things, with the full weight of them, without flinching, because flinching was never an option we were given. I thought about what Vor had said, that someone in this institution understood. I thought about Pren voting to abstain, and what that cost a careful, methodical Tharkan diplomat in a room full of people watching to see which way he fell. I thought about Lessa and the working group that was going to begin meeting next week, and the very long, very slow, very necessary work of two completely different kinds of civilizations, learning to understand each other well enough to build something together that neither could build alone. The galaxy had looked at us, for years, from a safe distance, and seen something that frightened them. Something that did not stop. Something that kept building and adapting and pushing forward past every point where they thought it would finally stop. They had called that something a monster in their reports, in their closed sessions, in the careful language of their classification systems. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it meant. A monster, where we come from, is not a word for something evil. It is a word for something that survives. Something that the world tried to break and could not. Something that takes the worst the universe can offer and wakes up the next morning and goes back to work. Earth did not raise heroes. It raised something that refuses to stop. The galaxy was never ready for that. But ready or not, here we are, and we are not going anywhere.